Welcome back, everybody, to the Mom and Mind podcast. I am your host, Dr. Kat, and today I'm also the guest. I'm really excited to bring this to you. Karen Kleiman graciously is interviewing me today on my own podcast, but for a very special reason for me to be able to share my story with you again. The first time I shared my story on this podcast is episode 1 of June in 2016. So many years ago, it feels like almost 7. And I was thinking, in honor of Maternal Mental Health Month in general, I wanted to bring my story back up to the top so that you guys who listen to the podcast and know me professionally as Dr. Kat can also understand a little bit about why I do what I do, why I'm so passionate about this cause and making sure that no parent feels alone in their journey. Because I did. I felt very alone in my journey, and you'll be able to hear some of the really big parts of my experience in this interview with Karen. And she's so good at interviewing. I really appreciated her questions, and it helped bring up and bring to light some of the things that I don't share about as often if I'm just, speaking off the cuff about my own experience. But I am hopeful that in me sharing my experience with you here today, that you will understand that depression, anxiety, and OCD happen in postpartum, and it can happen to any of us. My degree, my education, my whatever doesn't preclude me from experiencing mental health issues. Um, and it's just so real that all of us experience something at some time or another. So hopefully this helps to reduce the stigma and dispel the myth that postpartum depression and other perinatal mental health conditions don't happen that often, because they do. They're very common, but not necessarily normal, meaning that just because it happens to a lot of people doesn't mean it's okay for it to be happening to you. There's help available. There's a lot of help available these days. And so I appreciate you for coming along this journey with me so far, and I'm happy for you to hear part of my story. So thank you to Karen Kleiman. Let's hear from both of us. Well, thanks so much, Karen. It is such a delight to talk with you. I had so much fun on your interview when I interviewed you, and I'm really excited that you came on to interview me and to share my postpartum journey with everyone. I have shared it before in bits and pieces, but I think for, especially for things like Maternal Mental Health Month, it's nice to know that, people, all kinds of people are dealing with real stuff. And just because I have a degree in psychology, it doesn't bar me from having my own experience. So I'm excited to see what comes out of my mouth as you ask me questions about my journey.
Good. The timing is also great because of Mother's Day coming up,
Yes.
and how you and I both so fiercely advocate for taking care of ourselves
For sure.
and speaking the secret and saying what we need to say. And so this is great timing, and it's my privilege to swap seats with you and pretend like I know what I'm doing as I as I play the imposter host for the hour. So I actually, on a personal note, we've known each other for a very long time, um, with sort of parallel paths here professionally. But I know very little about you, and I really am quite curious about your deep dive into this work. So I've got lots of questions. We just start going right to it.
Yeah, well, yeah, let's get
Okay.
in.
Okay. So you said you've talked about this a little bit
Mhm.
before. In
Mhm.
in what capacity? Just sort of this kind of interview and
Yeah, I mean, I've had several interviews on podcasts and articles and whatnot where I'll share just kind of the sort of headline. I had postpartum depression, anxiety, and OCD after my first, and that launched me into this specialty. And in the very first episode of this podcast in June of 2016, I shared my own story. And if you happen to go back and listen to it, the audio is horrible because I really didn't know what I was doing at the time. But I felt like it was important to start this podcast on a story and a personal story and a bit of my why. But telling your own story when it's just you talking, I think is one thing, but having somebody ask you questions might, bring out different aspects of the experience that I don't normally say. Not because I don't want to, but it's just because I'm used to saying maybe the same thing.
Yeah, just as an overview, it sort of brings out those issues of that we're all so familiar with quite intimately, like self-disclosure and how much does my personal reproductive journey really matter when I'm certainly when I'm sitting in the room with a client and maybe I'm being triggered and there are all kinds of issues professionally that will be our next podcast we'll talk about.
Okay, good.
But for this one, I am really very curious to know from the beginning
Mhm,
what happened. So many professionals that go into this work
mhm,
find themselves sort of catapulted into it because of their own vulnerability and their own experience that sort of literally changed their life. So, can you
mhm,
go back to?
mhm.
Did you experience postpartum depression, anxiety, and OCD with both children, or just one?
For my first, yes, and my second, I did, but it was sort of I lovingly call it the light version.
Mm,
It was like postpartum light, because I had for the second I had put a lot of stuff in place. I had started to specialize, and I knew where my vulnerabilities were. Um, but for my first, after my daughter was born, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Um, and what I can say is that the pregnancy was planned and wanted, and for the most part was pretty easy. Actually, I felt better than I normally felt. Like I had a break from PMS, which was
mhm.
lovely. I highly recommend that. Because my PMS history has always been really difficult. So I wasn't dealing with those ups and downs. And I don't think I noticed, looking back on it, any real anxiety coming on until potentially the very last couple of weeks, looking back on it now. But even then, it was sort of relatively mild um, anxiety. I was having physical pain, which I had really, really bad carpal tunnel from all of the swelling in my body and the de Quervain's syndrome thing that happens in the thumb. It was incredibly painful. Um, so that part wasn't cool. Um, my labor with her was very long. Like contractions started at like Friday night, and I had her Monday morning, like mid morning. And my plan was an unmedicated birth, and I was able to do that. But I had back labor, and it was so painful. I had never experienced pain like that in my life. Um, and I knew enough for myself that I would need the support of a doula, so I had that, and so all of that was fine. It went okay. But right after she was born, she had um, aspirated like a tiny bit of meconium. And I didn't know that was a thing. And when she was in the little carrier right next to me, she had coughed up something that looked green, like slightly green. And I immediately felt like anxious and panicked.
Mhm.
Um, and I remember just constantly needing to have my eyes on her, making sure that nothing was going to happen, that she wasn't going to choke, that she wasn't going to, like, you know, aspirate again. Kind of like this new little being that I all of a sudden felt such an intense responsibility for. That was that was pretty overwhelming. And that was in the hospital. But it didn't register for me as like the beginning of things in any way. Um, but looking back on it now, I know that it was. That's when the anxiety started.
Were you familiar with anxiety before yourself, before you were pregnant?
Yeah, so I
Had you experienced it before?
mhm. Yeah, I had a history of depression and in high school, um, that was actually brought on from a concussion.
Mhm.
So, and injury, um, and I was like, it took me out of soccer. It took me out of my my trajectory in life, and I got pretty depressed after that. And then off and on after that, I experienced depression, and
So,
anxiety for sure. But I think even in college, when I was having panic attacks in college, it didn't. I just thought it was part of my PMS,
mhm.
and it was,
Or
but
part of college, right, right,
or both, yeah.
right. So, when you notice this, you're talking about in the hospital, you said you experienced this acute sort of hypervigilance and
Mhm.
checking with her, making sure she's okay and isn't aspirating. Were you aware at that time that it was too much anxiety? Did you think it was too much anxiety? Was it uncomfortable for you, or did it just feel like a normal response to what was going on?
Um, I didn't know enough to know that it was not normal. I know that now it was not it was I know now that it was sort of an overreaction to
Uh-huh.
what
Uh-huh.
was going on. Um, I think anxiety was a little bit harder for me to recognize because um, I think depression had always taken center stage.
Mhm.
So the anxiety that I did experience was just high functioning anxiety for years.
Mhm.
So it it didn't register that I was having anxiety at that time. Not at all. And as a matter of fact, none of it registered as depression or anxiety for a long time.
Oh, what you're describing so perfectly, Kat, is sort of that overlap that so many moms today still find themselves immersed in. Like, how do I know? I just had a baby. I've never had a baby. Of course,
Mhm.
I'm anxious, and of
Mhm.
course, I want to make sure she's breathing or not aspirating or
Mhm.
whatever. And so, sometimes it's sort of insulting when people label it as anxiety. It's like I'm a
Mhm.
new mom and I'm scared and I'm trying my best. And so how do we know? How do we know? How do we know if it's too much or not enough? Or
It really is hard to know, especially because it's new. Um, and I, for me, again, like this is all looking back. I didn't know at the time. Like, I know you hear this from a lot of moms, is it just felt like this is what it was supposed, like maybe this is just what motherhood is.
Huh.
Um, but it steadily got worse. Um,
Tell me about that. Tell me where it went from there and
yeah.
how you did know that something might be wrong.
Well, just it in terms of what, again, what I know now looking back is those getting home, um, and having no clue what was going on. So I should preface this with like me being a perfectionist, and that kind of pressure really does make this worse. Um, that I'm a highly sensitive person also, which makes it worse. Um, being totally like not knowing what she needed made me feel so inadequate. Not being able to figure out. So I was reading these books like how to tell your baby's language, like what does each cry mean? And in my mind, I was like, how the fuck am I ever gonna
Mhm.
know this? There is no way that I'm gonna be able to understand this about my kid and not like set in this other um panicky feeling like I'm not gonna know what to do. I'm gonna feel incompetent, inadequate, and all of those things. Um, some signs now that I know were were part of my anxiety. So, thankfully, I was able to nurse. But I was so worried that I wasn't going to remember how long she fed, which side she fed on, that I had a running list all of the time of which side, how long. And even if I wrote it down, I almost wasn't able to track like how and even trust that I wrote the right thing down.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's just was this like fogginess that came along with not sleeping very much. So that was one of the things that I noticed. One thing that I did have talked about in my story before is the so she slept next to me in a co sleeper right next to the bed, but I had the baby monitor on, so the receiver was next to her and the speaker was next to my ear. I had it right here, even though she was like less than arm's reach away. I was so worried that I wouldn't hear her if she needed me, or that I wouldn't hear her like stopping breathing. That was I would constantly check and make sure she was alive. Um, and so much so that I wasn't sleeping much. Um, I did the thing that I hear a lot of people do is like, okay, well, I just nursed her. I'm going to hold her up. Oh, she had a little bit of reflux also. That added to the concern that I'm not going to hear that she's like coughed up or something. So I would, keep her held up and for a little while and then, set her down. But um, I was just terrified that I wouldn't hear her. Um, so I kind of lost my story a little bit, but um, oh, right. I would nurse her and then think, okay, I spent however much time holding her up, and she's gonna wake up soon, so I'll just stay awake, which was like a massive downfall in my mental health, is
Mhm.
not letting myself sleep.
As I hear you talking, telling this story, it feels so, I can almost feel the predispositions,
Mhm.
setting you up for this disastrous sort of conflation of events. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
Um, because even if you weren't diagnosed with OCD or anxiety before, we know now that perfectionism is a fancy word that sort of encompasses a lot of that.
For
And
sure.
so we grow up with our perfectionism possibly being a great asset and helping us be focused and accomplished and
Hmm.
successful
Hmm.
in high school and in college and so on. It's also what predisposes us to, is she sleeping? Is she throwing up? Is she okay? I don't need to sleep. I can watch. I
Hmm.
can watch. I can watch.
Hmm.
So I hear you telling this story, and I'm picturing you with your baby over here, and the monitor over
Hmm.
here, and the hypervigilance in the middle, and it's
Hmm.
just like a superstorm waiting to
Oh yeah.
happen,
Yeah.
just
Absolutely.
waiting to happen. So what developed
Hmm.
symptom wise?
Hmm.
What are you, maybe in retrospect, hindsight, looking back, what did you start to feel or experience that you now know wasn't okay?
Hmm. Um, yeah. So that kind of vigilance, like not letting myself sleep, not wanting to sleep or miss anything. Um, I felt I felt really alone, like
Mm,
super duper alone. Um, I should say nobody knew what was happening.
mhm,
Nobody knew what was happening. I was so good at pretending like everything was okay. Um, and at like looking back on it now, I think, you know, I don't know from what was going on for my husband, but I felt really disconnected from him. There, meaning like it, it didn't feel like I could even share anything with him, not because anything he was doing, but because I didn't feel like I could tell anybody or I should tell anybody. Um, because I felt like a failure already. Like I, I the added layer of being a psychologist, a mental health clinician on top of all of this is like, well, I should be able to get through this, whatever it is. But I
Mhm.
didn't want to admit to myself that I was sad, that I was crying all the time, like that meant anything. Um, that I didn't feel connected to my daughter. I knew for sure that I cared about her and that I loved
Mhm.
her and I would like stop a speeding train for her, like all of those things. But when I kind of looked at her, I was like, I she didn't feel like mine.
Huh.
It's interesting too because my husband looks very different than me. He has blue eyes, he's tall, he's light brown hair, and she looked like him.
Mm.
And I was like, how did this light-skinned,
Mhm.
blue-eyed baby come out of me? And it was just a thing that added to like some sense of disconnection. Um, but I, yeah, I felt disconnected from her.
And did the disconnect feel anything, I don't know if I can express this right, other than you knew that there was something not right about that, but it sounds like you sort of blamed yourself for that and sort of I'm not doing this right, or is this just what mothering feels like, or whatever. Did it feel pathological? Did it feel uh,
No.
that no, it just felt like this is the way it is.
Yes.
And okay.
Yeah. There was no. I couldn't. Let me put it this way. Something didn't feel right, but it felt like it was me that wasn't right. It didn't feel
Yeah,
like I was like dealing
no,
with some clinical thing.
right.
Um, and I hate to admit it as like a therapist, but I didn't want anything to be wrong with me. I didn't want to acknowledge that something was off or wrong, or it was like embarrassing to
Sure.
admit it to anybody. Um, and then things just kept going like this, and um, after some time, I couldn't even tell you what the timeline was on this, but I went back to work at like 3 months. Um, Over time, the intrusive thoughts that I should say intrusive thoughts were there all along.
Mhm.
Um, but my intrusive thoughts became unbearable. Um, and this is one of those things that, I'm sort of having two hats on, both the experiencer and the therapist right now. Um, so whoever's listening who's had intrusive thoughts that are scary to them, just like take note if you need to take a step back. But I'm not going to give detail, but my intrusive thoughts were of a sexual nature,
Mhm.
and it freaked me out.
Mhm.
I was like racking my brain, like, why would I have these thoughts about my daughter? Um, like, have I been sexually abused? Have I repressed something that like I don't know about? What is happening here? And why would I why would I that even enter my mind? And I couldn't figure it out. But in dealing with them, Um, I would change diapers super fast. If I got an intrusive thought, I would just like literally close my eyes and shake my head and say like, no, 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 no. It became harder and harder to do things like baths and diapers and things like that. And then it started to shift over into worrying that my husband was doing something to
Mhm.
her. So I couldn't, oh gosh, I remember so vividly one time when it was like we would take turns doing baths and, we took turns with everything. So it was his turn, and I was pacing back and forth in the hallway um, while he was giving her a bath, and I was listening at the door. And I could not tolerate not being able to see what was happening in there. So I would go and check and be like, "How you guys doing? Do you need any help?" And like act out the like everything's fine. I'm just here to help kind of BS. And obviously they were fine. Everything was fine. But I went into the kitchen and just sat in the corner and bawled my eyes out. Just just in um such turmoil emotionally. Like I felt trapped in it. I couldn't not check on them. I couldn't get it out of my head. And it felt like it broke me. And I don't know if it like what happened first. I'm sort of running on about it. Um I don't even know how I dealt with that. All I know is that I cried and cried and cried. And it didn't it did I mean crying didn't help. I was still worried. I still had to go check on them again. And I still pretended like nothing was wrong.
And your husband still didn't know the extent to which you were suffering or the thoughts you were having.
Nope. Oh, I
So,
for sure couldn't tell him that. Like there's no way.
right. So the wow that I'm experiencing right now in listening to you is this was 12 years ago.
Mhm.
This wasn't 40 years ago.
Mhm.
And so you and I have talked before about the fact that in so many ways, so many things have changed, and in so many ways, so many things have not changed at all over the
Right.
course of forever that we've been doing this work. So 12 years ago, we would like to think as professionals that we had made enough movement forward that women could feel a little bit safer to
Mhm.
come out and say what they needed to say.
Mhm.
But as you point out, the shame is enormous and it's
Yeah.
silencing. And when you're a professional, it can be even more complex because of that. So
Oh
so
yeah.
there you were, literally on the floor, as you said so perfectly and poignantly, trapped.
Mhm.
We know that OCD can do that. That
Mhm.
brain can trap us.
Mhm.
We can't. How do I get out? How
There
do I
was
get out of
no
this?
it felt like there was no way out.
So what happened?
Um I like I said, it's interesting because I don't I don't remember a lot of like sequencing of events. It's all just one mashup of horrible. Um and gosh, I'm not really sure when it happened, but I do know that I had an intense amount of rage. Like an unbelievable feel. I had never experienced this intensity before in any way. I felt it like in my body, like it was always charged and I could just like punch through a wall. Just Hulk strength, blow shit up. I didn't. But it was like always there. I did actually. I did hit. I shared just a little bit of this in a reel that I made the other day. But I was so infuriated that I punched a door, and of course, I'm not thinking like, oh, this is gonna hurt. But it did. It really hurt, and I hurt myself doing it unintentionally. And it scared me a lot. It scared me a lot. So this is ha- the span of time before I realized and came to terms with what was going on was a year. It just built and built and built. I felt more depressed, more trapped. I'd be in my office crying in between clients. Because I was the therapist. It's like helping other people. And sitting there and feeling like, oh my God, like little did they know. I'm losing my shit. But I would like button myself up and thankfully at that time I had enough capacity as a therapist to be able to turn it on and turn it off so I could sit there, do the job, feel pretty good about how I was helping other people, and then in between sessions lose it, come back together and do it again. And that is exhausting. That's exhausting.
I should
S
say so.
Yeah. So it was like this big secret too.
Mhm.
Um that nobody I didn't want anybody to know. It was embarrassing. It was confusing. Like I didn't the thing is I didn't know anything about this. It wasn't discussed anywhere in grad school, in internships. It was like this sidebar that, oh, that there's this thing called postpartum depression, and that was it. So I didn't have any point of reference to understand really what was going on. Um, but just it just felt bad all the time.
You know, it's hard enough as a therapist to be going through anything at the same time that you're sitting in that sacred space with your client. But when you're going through the same thing, you know, or
Mhm.
different but
Mhm.
similar,
Mhm.
um, you know, and as you said, you almost have to dissociate a little bit, you know, and be the good therapist. And you can be. We
Mhm.
know that. We
Mhm.
can be really good at our job and still feel like shit when we,
Mhm.
you know, go home. We can do that and not compromise our work, you know, in
Mhm.
any way. But it also makes you feel less than. It also must have made you
Yeah.
feel so guilty on top of everything else that you were feeling. I'm
Mhm.
still concerned about the unknownness. Like,
Mhm. Mhm.
when did you realize you needed to reach out
Mhm.
or find out what's going on and get some help? How did you
Mhm.
get to that point?
So in my role, it was part of as a therapist, it was part of our intake process to give out a PHQ-9 to every new client. That's a depression screening scale for people who don't know what it is. Um, and I know the symptoms of depression backwards and forwards. It's like the kind of an everyday thing to figure out for other people. Um, but for whatever reason, I decided to sit down with myself and answer those questions as honestly as possible. And when I tallied the score, I was in a moderately severe range. And that to me was like, okay, like this is happening.
Okay, wait, back up for 1 second, Kat.
Hmm.
You said, for some unknown reason, I decided to
Hmm.
fill this out for myself. What was that? What was that? What got you to know that you needed to do that?
I can't remember the exact thing, but I do know now, again, like looking back, it's a little clearer that I knew something was not right. Um, and it must have gotten to a point that was just untenable. Like I couldn't anymore.
Mhm.
Um, um, I just I don't even know, like, we can talk about what it feels like in terms of breaking it down into to symptoms. Um, and like all the symptoms are there, but when it feels like everything's there all the time all at once, it's it just feels um I mean, I don't feel like there's even a good word for it. Horrible, sure. But I was lost. I was lost in it. I was in a fog all of the time. I wasn't thinking clearly, meaning like my memory was shot. I couldn't concentrate on stuff. At the time when it got to its kind of worst, me just crying all the time at work. It became it got to a point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't like pretend I was okay.
You're again doing a spectacular job of describing this sort of separation of self where there was enough of your observing self to know
Hmm.
that I don't like the way I'm feeling.
Hmm.
So there was sort of a I'm watching it happen kind of thing.
Yes.
And you know, I'm watching myself deteriorate, but at the same time, I know that's happening. And so you didn't feel prior to then, you didn't feel like you had the resources to access, but something scared the shit out of you enough
Hmm.
to say, help me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What was the help me? Where did you go? What was the first movement step that you took?
I went back to my therapist who I had been seeing for, um, gosh, I don't know how long. In like grad school, you're required to go to therapy. Well, my grad school required it anyways, which I think everybody should if you're going to be a therapist. Side side note. Um, it, but if so, she was my therapist throughout grad school, and I should say, without saying too much, I had a absolutely heinous 4 years throughout grad school, not because of school, but because of stuff that was going on in my family. So there were so many oh, and by the way, I had two more concussions along the way. So I was set up by
Our brain.
yeah, my brain was just hijacked
Mhm,
for
mhm.
so many different reasons. Um, so, that therapist, I went back to her. And even to her, I know that I didn't fully express what was happening. Um, yeah, no, even to her, I couldn't bring myself to say all of the things I was experiencing, but I
You
did tell her.
yet, by the way, sorry
What's
to
that?
interrupt you. Have you yet told somebody everything?
Yes. Yes, yes. Uh-huh. Yeah, I was trying to think of what I had told my now therapist. Therapy for life.
Mhm.
So um, oh, right. Um, I think at that time I had figured out, I had done the PHQ-9 thing. I knew I was dealing with depression, and I told her, I think I'm depressed. And she said, I don't think you're depressed. And I can tell you in less than a half a second, I shut down. I was like, oh, I can't tell you anything. And it, and this was somebody that knew a lot of my history, and I just didn't understand what that response was, and I couldn't ask at that point, well, what do you think is going on? I was just like, okay, I'm gonna shut down again.
Mm,
Um, so therapy at that point felt unsafe to me.
mhm.
Um, and I was having these, how can I say? I started to look into like alternative options for help. So I was like, well, maybe I could go. I was living in San Francisco at the time, so I had access to some more like hippy dippy woo woo type things, which I'm all for in certain circumstances. But for me, I was like, okay, maybe I need to go to like somebody who does energy healing, like Reiki or craniosacral therapy, and maybe that could help. So I did. I started going to her. Um, which ended up being a lot of like meditation and feeling feelings. It's almost like I had to bypass my my logic, my
Being
thinking
brain.
brain,
Yeah,
my
yeah.
executive function, because there was so much of me that wanted to stay buttoned up and not um you know fully feel all these feelings. So I needed to find some alternative way and to do that. So I went to her for a while. I went to a naturopathic doctor. Turns out my thyroid was also a little bit off. So that helped, but it didn't fix everything. So I was doing acupuncture and some alternative stuff because I honestly didn't feel safe with a therapist. Like if she didn't get it and she knows me best of anybody, then where am I to go?
Can you think now of what the perfect response for her would have been for you to hear?
Mm. It would have been nice if she were curious about what I was talking about
You said that,
and
right?
what I meant and what I was experiencing.
Mhm.
There was just like a whole cloth denial in that moment, and it did damage, frankly. Um, so I would have wanted her to be curious and to ask questions, and sitting where I sit now to know what questions to ask. Um, because I mean, you can ask questions and get to a certain point, but if you don't know the right questions to ask, you're only going to get so far. Um, so that would have been cool. It would have been nice also uh, for her to potentially recommend medication as an option. That was like definitely a no-no in that state of mind that I was in. And not because they did like, sure, take medication if that's what you need. I didn't care about it for anybody else. I was like an advocate for feeling better. But for me, there was still like I was still stuck in the shame and too much to realize that, again, knowing what I know now, I would have taken it right away because I suffered for a long time. Even after that, like year mark or so of that was just the beginning of recognizing it, you know. And then there's the journey out, which took a while because I didn't have the right help.
Struck by that feeling. Yeah, I'm sort of feeling that feeling of having so much pain and so much suffering and going to what you thought was a safe place. And hey, I'm smart enough to know something's going on here. Here's what I think might be going on. And then hearing like, by the way, your pretense, your facade that you are looking good, feeling good, sounding good worked.
Oh, for
It
sure.
totally worked.
It did.
And so I've sold my husband, I've sold my mother, I've sold my
Yep.
best friend, and now I've sold my therapist. So
Mm-hmm.
where
Mm-hmm.
can I possibly go from here? So it is, it's what we all know. We try and teach therapists who are interested in doing this work not to do that. Like
Mm-hmm.
if she's sitting in front of you, she's there because she's suffering. And if she looks good, she's just not telling you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. So for you to get that response, I can see, I can feel what that felt like for you, and the despair of knowing now there's no place for me to go. I can see why that sort of postponed your healing trajectory for quite some time.
Yeah, it really did.
Yeah.
It really did. I can't even. Oh, you know what? I think there's just moments I can remember where I put pieces together, like my aha moments, as Oprah calls them. That I think after I figured out what was going on, um, I um, gosh, I couldn't even tell you exactly how I figured it out. That it was postpartum related. But I started putting pieces together on my own because that's what it felt like. I didn't have any other options really, other than to figure it out on my own. Then I was pissed that like nobody knew, that I was left to suffer. Nobody asked me the right questions. I didn't learn about this in school, and I was really mad that I felt like I fell through those cracks, and I wanted to make sure that nobody else did, and which sent me on this trajectory, and it keeps getting, I'm deep in, I swim in this world, and I'm happy to. But at the time, I think I sought out some books. I thought I sought out a training. Um, I was really trying to understand what was going on for myself, and in those trainings is where I was putting more and more pieces together. And it was in a workbook that I was reading that I realized at that time that I'd had OCD, because I still hadn't figured that part out. And when I saw that, it was like the clouds parted. It was like, oh, I'm not this horrible person for thinking those thoughts. That it was happening to me, not that I was creating this, and or even wanting to have those thoughts. And that is a bit how the healing journey was for me. It was just like slowly putting pieces together and seeing it in a book, um, hearing it in a training was so affirming to me, to realize that it wasn't just me, and that I wasn't alone in this process, um, and that there was like a way to continue to feel better. Was just everything.
So stunned by the fact that you were so locked in 12
Mm-hmm.
years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I am. It's hard for me not to take this personally, that you didn't get one of my books and figure this out, but it's so worrisome to me that women like yourself just suffer for so long when there is access to information,
Mm-hmm.
but it's hard to find. And as you've said so brilliantly, it's hard to find the right place, and it's hard to to know even when you are in the right place that it is the right place. So I have no doubt in my mind that, and you have no doubt in your mind, I'm sure, that your experience is precisely what makes you so good at what you do, right?
Oh,
Because
yeah, yeah, it helps.
you're so driven by,
Mhm.
like you said, to protect women from experiencing this the way you did, that
Yeah.
you make sure when you're asked those questions or when somebody brings something to you that you probably press the pause button and make sure you do say what you believe they want to hear you say and need to
Mhm.
hear you say.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I've been on a trajectory to be a therapist. I knew at the age of 12 actually that I wanted to be a psychologist. So I set myself on that path, and I did that. But I always still felt like there was something missing. And then once um, once I realized what was happening, I was like, oh, there it is. This is what I'm supposed to do. And I don't. When did I have my daughter? I think it was 31,
Mhm.
maybe when I had my daughter, something like that. Um, so yeah, that set me on this specialty path. And yeah, to your point, I mean, I just actually had a session today with somebody that she broke through the clouds and is able to see that she's gonna get better. And it's just like I could cry right now. It is like the coolest fucking thing. I love it. And in part, I mean, obviously it's great for some people to be on their healing journey, but I think for me personally, it just I resonate with that feeling too of just finally feeling like, okay, it's gonna be okay. At some point, it's gonna be okay. It's magical. It's the coolest thing ever.
Your case too, you worked so hard by yourself for so long to
Hmm.
get there.
Hmm. Yeah, it was a tough road. It doesn't have to be that. You know this. Backwards and forwards, it doesn't have to be this hard. I mean, we can't make sure that nobody ever suffers, but we can sure as hell get them out of it more quickly.
Mhm. One of the important lessons that you've expressed is, how do you know if you're in the right place? How do you know if this therapist is going to help you? And one of the things I once said to my daughter, she said, how did you know that daddy was the right person for you to, spend your whole life with? You just know.
Hmm.
You just know. If you're a woman, I think I can say this, all gender biases aside, women know when they're okay and when they're not okay, for the most part. And they know if they're safe or if they're not safe.
Hmm.
And you knew something was wrong before you knew something was wrong. You
Correct.
knew that your therapist was not a safe place for you when your therapist was not a safe place for you. That doesn't mean she wasn't a wonderful therapist or a wonderful
Exactly.
human being,
Right.
but it wasn't a place that you felt you could disclose or talk to. And so, you can't write this in a book. You can't put it on a prescription pad. But one of the things that you and I often say is, if you think something is wrong, it probably is. That doesn't mean something catastrophic is happening,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
it means trust your instincts and don't
Absolutely.
stop until you find a place that you feel safe and can talk about it. Because you really had a rough road there, but it's taken you to some super fabulous place now, don't you think?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't change it.
Yeah.
It would have
Hmm.
been cool to not suffer, but like
Hmm.
whatever. Here. I'm cool now. Everything's fine.
Hmm.
Um, it was a tough road, but it really did lead to some great things.
Hmm. Your journey, which was so complicated and so prolonged, I guess if you believe in the universe, and cosmic things happening, has brought you to, this full circle place where you set the stage for other women, other professionals, everybody to come and talk to you about this and to tell you about their journey. And in addition to, writing books and doing your psychotherapy, this podcast is so. I have to tell you, behind the scenes, people talk about this a lot. I mean, my team, we talked about it today, this morning, and they're like, "Oh, she's my favorite. I listen to her when I'm running. I listen to her when I run." It's
So
true.
cool.
So, there's a lot happening behind the scenes that you don't know about, but it has brought you to this spectacular place that I'm always so honored to be a part of. So, thank you for telling me your story and for sharing it with everybody else, and and for being who you are, because we all appreciate that the story got you here, and we get all this good stuff from you.
Thank you, Karen. This was great. I'm honored that you wanted to do this with me, and I hope it's helpful for people who are listening. And you just you're so good at what you do. I know this wasn't therapy, but I know how skilled you are in your work, and I appreciate all that you bring to the world.
Thank you.
Well, that's my experience in a nutshell. Certainly, having suffered for such a long time, there are other details and other facets to my experience that didn't necessarily come out this time. But honestly, it's not because I'm hiding anything anymore. At the time, I was. But I don't think that we deserve for our stories to be silent and grow in the dark. It is so empowering, I believe, to hear other people's stories. And even if you never share your story personally, hearing from somebody else who has a similar experience really does help shed a light on your experience in the world and help you to feel less alone. And I hope that in this case also prompts you to get the help that you need and deserve. I hope prompts you to get the help that you need and deserve. I thank you so much for being with us. Until next time.